Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to imagine a world where autonomous robot swarms build physical houses.
Right.
And these houses, they can only be unlocked by Bitcoin. Like imagine a reality where traditional taxes, welfare, and even, political voting, they're entirely replaced by encrypted anonymous code.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are taking on a mission that pushes far past the standard boundaries of, normal economic theory or political science.
Yeah, we're looking at a very dense, highly provocative stack of sources today.
Exactly. And these sources, they propose a radical, ground-up redesign of human society. The core argument here is that human government in literally any form is fundamentally obsolete.
That is the architectural blueprint we are examining, yeah. The sources build this deeply complex argument that human nature, specifically the biological and psychological drivers that create wealth, they inevitably corrupt the management of that wealth.
Right, because the creators inevitably morph into defenders.
Exactly. And this triggers an endless destructive cycle of class conflict, wealth extraction, and, well, systemic decay.
So what's the proposed solution from the authors?
The proposed solution is to utilize cold, impartial automation. They're talking about a synthesis of artificial intelligence and advanced blockchain architecture. The goal is to completely sever human emotion and, political maneuvering from property management.
And by doing this, they suggest we can just dissolve the state apparatus entirely?
Right. Eliminate the perpetual battle over resources and allow the sovereign biological family to resurge as the primary self-governing unit of society.
Okay, so before we really get into the weeds and start mapping out the mechanics of this proposed reality, I need to establish a very crucial ground rule for you, the listener.
Yeah, this is important.
The material we are diving into today contains concepts that completely upend traditional political narratives. I mean, we are going to be discussing highly specific, biologically essentialist gender roles.
Which is obviously controversial.
Highly controversial. We are going to examine purely mechanistic interpretations of historical labor movements and global conflicts. So, our role today is to act purely as impartial cartographers.
We are just mapping the territory.
Exactly. We're treating this as a massive, complex thought experiment. We are not here to take sides, we are not endorsing these viewpoints, and we're not here to apply modern ethical judgments to them. We are simply unpacking the internal logic of this alternate societal blueprint to see exactly how its gears turn.
It's an exercise in extreme objective synthesis because the authors of these sources, they are drawing from a very wide array of disciplines.
Like what, specifically?
Well, evolutionary psychology, advanced cryptography, decentralized finance, and, macroeconomic historical cycles.
That's a wild mix.
It is. And to genuinely understand the machinery they are describing, it requires us to temporarily detach from our current political attachments. We have to look at the system they're proposing purely in terms of inputs, outputs, and thermodynamic stability.
Right. So if the human element is the supposed failure point here, we need to understand the exact nature of that failure. The sources have a specific term for the disease that they claim is currently killing our societal operating system.
Yes, they call it incompetence creep.
Incompetence creep.
Yeah.
So what are the actual mechanics of this systemic disease?
Well, the foundation relies on viewing human hierarchies through a thermodynamic lens. It's essentially the synthesis of two established frameworks.
Okay, lay them out for me.
First, you have the Peter Principle, which posits that in any hierarchical organization, an employee will inevitably be promoted to their level of incompetence, and they just stay there, clogging the system.
Right, because they were good at the last job, but terrible at the new one.
Exactly. Second, you have the Red Queen hypothesis from evolutionary biology. This dictates that an organism must constantly adapt and evolve just to maintain its current position in a shifting environment.
So you have a system where individuals are constantly being pushed upward into roles they can't handle, while the environment around them requires increasing complexity just to survive.
Yes.
I mean, that sounds mathematically unsustainable.
It creates a terminal bottleneck. Let's apply this directly to the dynamics of wealth and class, which is where the sources focus their critique.
Okay, let's do that.
Consider the initial wealth accumulators in a society. These creators possess a specific alignment of grit, timing, risk tolerance, and competence to build something of tangible value. They generate resources.
But as that wealth scales.
As it scales, the complexity of managing it scales exponentially. The creator transitions from the active role of building wealth to the passive protective role of defending it. They are promoted by their own success into the role of a lord.
And building an empire requires a completely different cognitive toolkit than defending one.
Precisely. The adaptation required to create is not the same adaptation required to manage. But the critical failure point, the absolute breaking point, occurs at the point of inheritance.
Ah, right, passing it down to the kids.
Right. These creators inevitably pass this amassed wealth and the societal power attached to it down to their progeny.
And the heirs inherit the physical property, the entitlement, but
But they do not genetically inherit the specific hard-won management competence that generated the wealth in the first place.
oh, wow. So you end up with a societal architecture where the apex is heavily populated by individuals who possess immense resources, but lack the fundamental capacity to understand or optimize the systems that generate those resources.
Yes, they have all the defensive mechanisms to maintain their status, but none of the operational knowledge to justify it.
That is brutal.
And that is only the first half of the disease. The second half is the reactionary pressure from the base of the hierarchy.
The laborers.
Right. The laborers, the people actually interacting with the physical systems of production, they observe this dynamic. They look up and see a class of non-working, incompetent employers hoarding resources.
Which has to create massive friction.
Massive thermodynamic friction. Value creation feels entirely asymmetrical. In response, the laborers leverage the only tool available to them, which is collective force.
Now, the text defines force quite broadly here, right? It's not just literal pitchforks and torches.
No, it spans the entire spectrum of coercion. I mean, it can manifest as literal kinetic revolutions, sure, but more often in modernized societies, it takes the form of aggressive labor unionization.
Or using the democratic voting apparatus to mandate taxation.
Exactly. The goal is always the same: to extract sustenance from the property owners via an applied mechanism of force rather than through direct, mutually voluntary labor exchange.
So the moment the laborers shift their energy from creating value for the property to extracting value from the property owner, the system begins to consume itself.
The compounding tragedy, according to the sources, is that once these labor movements or the political advocates representing them successfully seize power, they instantly fall into the exact same incompetence trap.
Wait, really? The liberators become the problem?
Right, because they possess revolutionary competence or political competence, but they lack the operational management acumen to run the industries they just hijacked.
So they have to rely on coercion instead of innovation.
Yes. Therefore, they rely on further coercion to maintain their new status. Their own progeny are raised in a cultural paradigm where resource acquisition is tied to systemic adversarialism and political maneuvering.
Rather than creating tangible value.
Exactly. It becomes a downward evolutionary spiral. Incompetence generates resentment, resentment generates political upheaval, and the upheaval installs a new, different flavor of incompetence.
This framework leads directly into one of the most intense, provocative sections of the source material, their analysis of the 20th century, specifically the massive century of conflict from 1914 to 1991.
It's a very striking analysis.
The text completely strips away the traditional ideological narratives of World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. They don't look at it as a battle for democracy or a clash of moral philosophies.
No, they frame that entire 77-year period as a sheer biological resource management event.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The sources interpret the conflicts from 1914 to 1991 as a continuous violent mechanism for managing surplus male testosterone in the wake of industrial obsolescence.
That is a purely mechanistic view of history.
It is. To understand this, we have to look at the baseline shift caused by the maturation of the Industrial Revolution.
Right, the transition from muscle power to machine power. When you introduce steam engines, assembly lines, mechanize agriculture, the fundamental unit of labor changes.
Exactly. In a pre-industrial agrarian or artisanal economy, physical strength and endurance traits biologically concentrated in the male population due to higher testosterone variants were at an absolute premium.
So the male biological profile was perfectly aligned with the economic demands of resource acquisition.
Yes. However, as industrial machinery scaled, the actual physical products of industry began to fall in relative value due to mass production, and the requirement for sheer physical strength plummeted.
Because a machine could generate the kinetic force. A human only needed to pull the lever.
Right. So the business owners, the new industrial lords, realized they don't need to pay a premium for a physically robust male workforce. To maintain their profit margins as the value of goods drops, they pivot to cheaper, perhaps more compliant labor pools.
Historically, this meant the rapid integration of women and children into the factory systems.
It did, and this economic pivot displaced millions of working-class men. Their traditional avenue for resource acquisition and status generation was suddenly devalued by the very machinery they helped build.
And relying on evolutionary psychology, the text emphasizes that you cannot simply displace a massive population of biologically driven, status-seeking males and expect a peaceful societal transition.
Exactly. That biological drive for provisioning and hierarchy, it doesn't vanish. It redirects.
They didn't just accept obsolescence, they organized. This is where the sources argue the labor union movement fundamentally mutated.
Yes, the displaced men organized into labor unions, but the sources argued these unions were not merely seeking fair wages. They were effectively establishing themselves as new lords.
By using collective force, strikes, and physical blockades.
Right. They were defending their now obsolete labor positions against the cheaper, more efficient labor pool. They weaponized their collective physical threat to force the industrial owners to maintain their status.
So the wealth creators of the industrial age became defenders of their capital, and the laborers formed unions to become defenders of their wages.
Locking the two into a massive societal-level stalemate.
But how did this leap from factory strikes to the trenches of the Somme or the proxy wars of the Cold War?
The sources argue that this immense buildup of localized adversarial energy, millions of men organized into collective combative structures, eventually breached the capacity of local industry to contain it.
The pressure got too high.
Yes, the national governments, acting as the ultimate societal managers, recognized this surplus of aggressive, unutilized male energy as an existential threat to domestic stability.
So what did they do?
Therefore, the global conflicts of the 20th century were, at their core, massive worker movements elevated to the state level.
That is a staggering reframing. You're saying the text views the mobilization for World War I not as a complex web of alliances and assassinations, but as a pressure release valve for industrial labor surplus.
The alliances were the spark, but the fuel was the surplus demographic of displaced labor. The state absorbed this male energy, unified it under nationalist ideologies, and directed it outward against competing states.
Wow.
And the sources take this even further when analyzing the aftermath, specifically the rise of communism and fascism. They frame both of these totalitarian systems as competing macro-level worker movements.
Vast state-run apparatuses designed to capture, direct, and completely conscript all idle male energy.
Precisely. So instead of fighting the factory owner, the state becomes the factory owner, and the entire population is mobilized into a perpetual state of industrial military production.
In doing so, the state pits laborers of one nation against the laborers of another in endless grinding proxy wars. The Cold War is viewed as a systemic, controlled burn of economic pressure.
The irony, as the sources point out, is that the very movements that promised to liberate the worker from the industrial lord simply installed the state as the ultimate inescapable lord.
Because the liberators inevitably became the masters. The underlying mechanism, humans managing other humans' resources, remained perfectly intact.
Exactly.
This historical analysis relies heavily on an analogy that permeates the entire stack of research we are looking at, the eternal cyclical war between the lords and the lawyers.
Yeah, that dynamic is central.
If human history is just a rotating cast of these two archetypes, we need to define them explicitly within this framework.
The terminology is specific here. A lord is any entity, an individual, a corporation, or a state that hoards property, controls access to resources, and extracts value from those resources.
Often prioritizing defense of that wealth over continued innovation.
Right. A lawyer in this context is not just a legal practitioner in a courtroom. A lawyer represents the advocate class. They are the bureaucrats, the politicians, the union leaders, and the lobbyists who represent the grievances of the excluded laborers against the lord.
And the currency of the lawyer is language, regulation, and political leverage, whereas the currency of the lord is physical capital and property.
Correct.
The text uses the Black Death in the 14th century as the ultimate case study for how this power dynamic shifts.
The economic shockwave of the Black Death perfectly illustrates this pivot. Prior to the plague, the European immemorial system was a rigid hierarchy. The feudal lord controlled the land, and the serfs were legally bound to it.
They were essentially part of the property.
Yes. When the plague eradicated a massive percentage of the population, it completely inverted the thermodynamic balance of the economy.
Because suddenly, agricultural land, the primary source of wealth, was abundant, but the human capital required to work it was incredibly scarce.
The value of labor skyrocketed exponentially. For the first time, the peasants possessed significant economic leverage.
So what do the lords do?
Recognizing this, the lords attempted to artificially cap wages and restrict movement, such as the Statute of Laborers in England. But the economic reality overpowered the legal fiction.
The serfs realize their worth.
Exactly. The serfs, now highly valuable, began to hire early advocates, clerks, royal court intermediaries, essentially the first lawyers to legally break their feudal bonds and secure their right to mobility.
So the lawyers effectively dismantled the traditional feudal system by advocating for the laborers.
They did. The lawyers successfully liberated the peasants from the direct bodily exploitation of the lords. Consequently, the definition of a lord had to evolve.
How so?
A lord transitioned from someone who explicitly owned people tied to the land to someone who merely owned the property and engaged in wage labor contracts. It was a massive societal shift, facilitated entirely by the advocate class.
But the sources don't stop at medieval Europe. They apply this exact same lord versus lawyer metric to the founding of the United States.
Which is going to agitate anyone attached to the traditional patriotic narrative of the American Revolution.
Oh, for sure. The text views the American Revolution not as a spontaneous uprising for abstract philosophical liberty, but as a calculated property dispute orchestrated by a highly organized class of colonial lawyers.
Figures like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton were literal legal advocates. In this framework, these colonial lawyers were essentially hired by the colonial population to sever their economic and legal obligations to their ultimate lord, King George III of England.
But the sources dig into the underlying economic friction that prompted this. It wasn't just about taxation without representation. It was about two distinct, emerging property models in the colonies colliding with the stagnant property model of the crown.
Right. The analysis highlights the divergence in the colonial economy. In the northern colonies, early industrialization, shipbuilding, and complex mercantile networks were rendering the old, purely extractive agricultural model of the British Empire obsolete.
The northern merchants were generating new wealth that didn't require validation or management from a monarch across the ocean.
Exactly. However, their primary customers for these ships and industrial goods were the southern plantation owners.
And the southern plantation system was essentially a contemporary, highly optimized version of feudalism, relying on chattel slavery. They were the new, localized lords.
The text argues that the northern industrial lawyers and the southern agricultural lords formed an alliance of convenience.
Because the crown was restricting their trade through acts like the Navigation Acts
Mm-hmm.
and taxing their legal mechanisms heavily, such as with the Stamp Act.
Right. They recognized a shared short-term need to eliminate the overarching British lord to protect and expand their respective property models.
And the lawyers utilized their expertise in political philosophy and constitutional framing to legitimize the break from the crown.
They successfully liberate the colonies. But the text points out the insidious nature of the lawyer archetype. Once the lord is removed, the lawyer doesn't just dissolve the power structure they occupy.
Exactly. By drafting the legal architecture of the new state, the lawyers institutionalized their own power.
They liberated the colonists from the king, but simultaneously installed themselves as the necessary bureaucratic intermediaries for all future property disputes, taxation, and governance.
The lawyers essentially took the centralized power of the lord and distributed it among themselves within a newly minted state apparatus.
Yes.
So if history is genuinely just this exhausting cyclical pendulum swing, the lords hoard the wealth until it stagnates, the lawyers weaponize the resentment of the masses to tear down the lords, and then the lawyers build a new bureaucracy that eventually becomes just as stagnant and extractive. My immediate logical question is, why doesn't redistribution solve the math?
That's a great question.
If the wealth accumulates too heavily at the top, triggering this systemic friction, why doesn't political redistribution simply reset the board and restore equilibrium?
That is the pivotal question, and the source's answer is foundational to their entire thesis. They argue that political redistribution is a catastrophic thermodynamic failure because it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of wealth.
How so?
Their argument relies on the premise that genuine, sustainable wealth is absolutely inseparable from the specific competence required to generate and manage it.
So they're rejecting the idea that wealth is simply a static pile of resources, like a mountain of gold sitting in a vault waiting to be dispersed.
That's a crucial distinction. In their view, a pile of gold is just dormant matter. Wealth is the applied knowledge, the operational network, and the localized competence required to utilize that gold productively.
Okay, that makes sense.
When a lawyer representing the state or a political movement confiscates property through taxation, eminent domain, or revolutionary force, they are only capturing the dormant matter. They cannot confiscate the competence. The moment the asset is severed from the productive owner, it ceases to be true wealth. It is stripped of the moral claim, the specific localized knowledge, and the productive incentive that created it.
It transitions from a productive asset into a political tool.
And this accelerates the incompetence creep. The state transfers these confiscated resources to a new class of administrators, bureaucrats, or favored political constituents who inherently lack the management acumen to optimize them.
So the resources decay.
The resources decay, the industries stagnate, and the state must then increase its coercive extraction to maintain the illusion of prosperity.
The sources adamantly claim that redistribution never, in any historical context, creates sustained prosperity. It merely resets the cycle by installing a new, less competent class of defenders.
Exactly. And they argue that this relentless cycle of extraction and redistribution has fundamentally degraded our modern economy.
Right, they use two very distinct terms to describe this shift. They claim we have abandoned a tool economy and devolved into a toy economy.
This is a devastating critique of modern late-stage macroeconomic structures. A tool economy is fundamentally rooted in physical reality and competence.
It is based on building, producing, engineering, and maintaining the actual tangible infrastructure of civilization, right? Like energy grids, agriculture, heavy manufacturing, logistics.
Yes, it requires rigorous, objective competence, because failure in a tool economy has immediate physical consequences. If a bridge is engineered poorly, it collapses.
The feedback loop is instantaneous and undeniable. You can't bluff your way through building a hydroelectric dam. So what defines the toy economy?
A toy economy emerges when a society produces a massive surplus of resources, allowing a significant portion of the population to detach from physical production.
So the economy shifts heavily toward consumption, distraction, hyperfinancialization.
And what the text identifies as the validation economy. In a toy economy, status and wealth are no longer derived from creating tangible value, but from manipulating symbols, managing public perception, generating digital engagement, and navigating bureaucratic labyrinths.
It is an economy optimized for ego gratification rather than civilizational maintenance.
Yes. And this ties directly into their aggressive critique of universal basic income, or UBI.
Right, because right now there are massive tech utopian movements arguing that as artificial intelligence and automation replace physical and cognitive labor, the state should simply distribute a monthly UBI check to every citizen.
The vision being that we are freed from the drudgery of work to pursue art, philosophy, and leisure.
But these sources view UBI as absolute poison to a society.
They view UBI as the terminal symptom of what they call idiocracy syndrome.
Right, bureaucracy syndrome, okay.
In a system where human labor is increasingly obsolete, providing a baseline income with no requirement for reciprocal production actively subsidizes incompetence. You are financially incentivizing an unemployable mass to consume the outputs of a toy economy, digital entertainment, synthetic validation, recreational distractions.
You decouple survival from competence entirely.
Exactly. The text characterizes UBI not as a utopian liberation, but as a bribe to prevent revolution.
A bribe?
Yes. The state taxes the shrinking minority of highly competent individuals who are still maintaining the complex automated infrastructure of the tool economy. They funnel those resources through a massive bureaucratic apparatus, empowering millions of lawyers to pacify the idle masses.
It creates a terrifying, fragile feedback loop.
The competents are drained to fund the incompetent, and the state grows infinitely larger to manage the transaction.
So if human management inherently decays, if the lords and lawyers will endlessly consume the resources of the competent till the system collapses into a stagnant toy economy, what is the escape velocity? If human nature is the thermodynamic failure point, how do we break the cycle?
The solution proposed by the sources is absolute and radical. You must remove human biology, human emotion, and human political maneuvering from the management of property entirely.
Okay, this is where we pivot from the diagnosis of the disease to the proposed antidote. We are looking at a future where the concept of property control is entirely handed over to cold, impartial automation. We are talking about replacing the entire legal and judicial architecture of society with encrypted code.
The mechanical heart of this proposal relies on blockchain technology. specifically the utilization of highly complex smart contracts on decentralized networks, akin to advanced iterations of Ethereum.
A smart contract is, at its core, self-executing code, right?
Right. You take the rules of ownership, the conditions of transfer, the rights to dividend distribution, and the penalties for breach of contract, and you embed them directly into the digital architecture of the asset itself.
Let's ground this. Right now, if I buy a piece of land, there is a paper deed sitting in a county clerk's office somewhere. If someone disputes my ownership, or if I want to sell it, we have to hire lawyers, go before a human judge, pay escrow fees, and rely on the coercive power of the state's police force to enforce the judge's interpretation of that piece of paper. The state is a mandatory middleman for every transaction.
In the proposed system, the physical land is represented as a cryptographic token on an immutable blockchain.
Okay.
The smart contract acts as the judge, jury, and executioner of the transaction simultaneously and instantaneously. If the pre-programmed mathematical conditions of the contract are met, for instance, the required amount of cryptocurrency is deposited into a specific wallet address, the asset transfers automatically.
And if the conditions are not met,
The transfer fails.
there's zero human friction.
None. The code becomes a self-enforcing, perfectly impartial defender of wealth. It is entirely immune to the psychological traps of incompetence creep. The blockchain does not possess an ego.
It cannot be lobbied by a special interest group.
It doesn't care about your political affiliation, your demographic background, or the emotional weight of your grievance. There is no room for a lawyer to argue a technicality, and there is no mechanism for a lord to arbitrarily hoard an asset if the contract dictates it must be released. It executes with cold, mathematical finality.
This leads to a fascinating historical reevaluation in the text regarding the concept of voting.
Yes, this part's quite interesting.
We are so conditioned to view universal suffrage as the ultimate moral endpoint of a civilized society. When we look back at early America, where voting was restricted almost exclusively to property owners, we analyze that through a modern lens, as a malicious, intentional exclusion of the working class, women, and minorities.
But the sources strip away that moral framing and look at it purely as an engineering schematic.
How so?
They describe the modern perspective on historical voting as a cart before the horse cognitive error. In the context of early agrarian or mercantile societies, voting was not conceptualized as a universal human right tied to one's existence. It was engineered as a highly specific functional mechanism for managing property and taxation.
Because the state, at that time, was relatively small, and its primary function was literally just managing disputes over land, borders, and commerce.
Precisely. The legislation being debated and enacted was almost exclusively concerned with the regulation of tangible assets and the levying of taxes on those assets to fund collective defense.
Therefore, the architectural logic of the system dictated that only individuals with a verified physical stake in that economic engine, the property owners, should possess the administrative right to manage it.
The sources argued that the fact that demographics skewed ownership heavily toward white males was a byproduct of the existing legal and economic realities of that era, rather than the singular malicious purpose of the voting restriction itself.
The restriction was fundamentally about aligning administrative control with systemic skin in the game.
Exactly.
The implication of that is massive. If voting was originally designed merely as a tool to manage property disputes among humans, what happens when humans are no longer managing the property?
If smart contracts assume the total administration of property, if the court automatically dictates resource allocation, executes land transfers, and mathematically distributes dividends without human input, the foundational structural need for property-based political voting entirely evaporates.
You don't need a legislative body to debate tax rates or zoning laws. If the allocation of resources is hard-coded into the immutable ledger of the assets themselves.
Right.
Rightful ownership is no longer a political debate. It is a mathematical certainty embedded in the property.
And by eliminating the political management of property, you render the entire mechanism of political redistribution obsolete. The lawyer class of advocates, the vast armies of politicians, lobbyists, regulatory bureaucrats, and tax assessors are completely disintermediated from the economy.
You cannot organize a voting bloc to lobby a piece of cryptographic code.
You cannot emotionally manipulate a blockchain into passing a subsidy.
The sources state this beautifully, actually. Demanding rights from property owners in the form of political redistribution is simply a confirmation that you are, in fact, owned by them.
It is an admission of subservience to the Lord. By shifting to an architecture of smart contracts, you don't just defeat the lord, you eliminate the concept of the master entirely.
Property becomes self-sovereign, and human interaction with that property becomes purely transactional and voluntary.
Yes.
Now, this isn't just speculative fiction set in the year 2100. The texts specifically ground this in the context of the mid-2020s. They point to pilot programs and decentralized finance protocols that are actively testing these exact mechanisms right now.
We can observe the genesis of this in the current tokenized real estate markets. Platforms like Realty, Propy, or Meridio are actively fractionalizing physical real estate.
How does that work in practice?
A commercial apartment building is divided into thousands of unique digital tokens on a blockchain. If you possess one of these tokens in your digital wallet, the underlying smart contract intercepts the rental income paid by the tenants, converts it into a stablecoin, and automatically deposits your exact fractional share into your wallet on a daily basis.
You completely bypass the traditional financial bureaucracy. There is no escrow company holding your funds for 30 days. There is no traditional bank charging maintenance fees.
There is no property management conglomerate skimming off the top to fund their corporate headquarters. It is a direct, frictionless, mathematical transfer of value from the asset to the owner.
It sounds incredibly efficient. But as impartial cartographers, we have to stress test the architecture. What are the systemic vulnerabilities here?
There are definitely risks.
If we completely dismantle the state and hand the keys to civilizational resource management over to a network of automated blockchains, aren't we just swapping one set of elites for another? Instead of lords hoarding physical land and lawyers manipulating political laws, don't we just end up in a technocracy where coders are kings?
The sources are acutely aware of this vulnerability. They dedicate significant analysis to the risk of technocratic capture. If the underlying code of these foundational smart contracts is flawed, or if the cryptographic layers contain intentional backdoors, a highly competent malicious actor could absolutely manipulate the algorithms.
You could see a hyper-concentration of wealth executed at the speed of light, controlled by a microscopic elite who understand the cryptography.
There is also the issue of artificial intelligence integration. If these smart contracts rely on AI or machine learning models to dynamically assess value or allocate resources, those models have to be trained on data, and historical data is created by humans.
Which means the data is inherently laced with historical human biases.
The text references the well-known case of an early Amazon AI hiring tool. The system was designed to autonomously evaluate resumes and select the top candidates. However, because it was trained on a decade of historical hiring data from a male-dominated tech industry, the AI inadvertently learned to penalize resumes that included the word women's, such as women's chess club captain.
Wow. The AI wasn't maliciously sexist. It was just ruthlessly optimizing based on the flawed historical data it was fed. It encoded the bias into its logic.
Precisely. If an AI managing property allocation or resource distribution is trained on the historical data of the lord and lawyer dynamic, it could seamlessly perpetuate those exact inequalities under the guise of objective mathematics.
So what's the proposed mitigation for this within the sources?
They argue for radical transparency and decentralized verification. All governance code must be rigorously open source, constantly subjected to decentralized, incentivized audits by the global network, and heavily reliant on zero-knowledge proofs to maintain individual privacy while verifying systemic integrity.
But the core tension remains. You are fundamentally trusting the math. You're transferring your faith from a flawed human judge in a robe to a highly complex cryptographic hash.
You are.
Okay, let's follow the logic of the sources to its ultimate conclusion. Let's assume the engineering is sound. We successfully deploy this architecture. The state apparatus dissolves.
The courts, the welfare system, the tax agencies, and the central banks are entirely replaced by an invisible, frictionless layer of impartial smart contracts.
The government, as we currently conceptualize it, simply evaporates. What occupies the vacuum? If there is no overarching state to organize human behavior, what becomes the fundamental building block of society? People still have to reproduce, raise children, and navigate physical reality.
If you remove the massive, centralized state designed to extract taxes, manage welfare, and enforce macro-level property laws, the systemic architecture naturally devolves to its most basic, decentralized, and biologically resilient node. According to the sources, that node is the sovereign biological family.
This brings us to a critical junction in the source material, the resurgence of the family as the primary unit of governance. And listener, This is the exact point where the text integrates deeply controversial evolutionary psychology.
Right.
It maps out highly specific, rigidly defined gender roles that they argue are biologically essential for the stability of a post-state society. Again, we are mapping the territory impartially to understand how they believe this prevents the return of the Lord-lawyer dynamic.
hmm
How exactly do the sources define the functional roles within this new familial unit?
In this hypothesized post-state environment, the sources propose an architecture where gender roles are not viewed as social constructs, but as highly optimized, biologically essentialist tools designed to interface perfectly with the automated property systems.
Okay.
The structure is strictly binary. Men are positioned outward, acting as freelance property creators, physical resource acquirers, and infrastructure developers.
So rather than being an heir defender of stagnant family wealth or an exploited union laborer in a factory, the man is thrust into the decentralized market.
Yes. The text draws a direct line between the male biological profile, specifically the higher variance in testosterone, and the behavioral traits required for high-risk resource acquisition, exploration, and physical construction. The male is tasked with utilizing that biological drive to interface with the cold, automated economy, acquiring the tokenized assets and physical resources necessary for the family's survival.
And what is the engineered role of women in this architecture?
Women are positioned inward. The sources define their role as the sovereign human resource managers of their specific biological progeny.
So they're managing the family internally.
The argument presented is that the modern state and the corporate toy economy have artificially incentivized women to seek validation from bureaucratic structures or corporate hierarchies designed by the old lords.
In this new model, that external validation economy is destroyed.
Exactly. The woman acts as the absolute manager of the family's internal development, focusing entirely on nurturing, educating, and instilling baseline competence in the next generation.
So the male interfaces with the external mathematical reality of the smart contracts, and the female interfaces with the internal biological reality of human development. Now, to modern sensibilities, this sounds like a massive regression. It sounds incredibly restrictive. Why do the authors of these sources firmly believe that imposing this specific, rigid structure is the only way to actually reduce societal conflict?
Because, in their view, it surgically removes the exact hierarchical overlaps that generate class warfare. At a macro level, this structure completely annihilates the employer versus employee dynamic.
There are no massive corporations exploiting vast pools of labor. Labor is fundamentally familial, localized, and entirely voluntary, directed solely toward the survival and elevation of your own direct genetic lineage.
You are never working to enrich a distant lord. You are only ever working to enrich your own family unit.
Furthermore, they argue it resolves the lord versus lawyer dynamic at the micro level within the household itself, right?
It does. The sources present a highly critical view of modern domestic relations, arguing that the modern state has essentially weaponized the family unit.
How so? Walk me through their logic on that.
They argue that in the current paradigm, the husband often functions as a microlord, generating the primary external resources. The wife, however, is heavily incentivized by the overarching state apparatus to act as a microlawyer.
The state provides the legal mechanisms.
Yes, such as heavily biased family courts, no-fault divorce laws, and state-backed alimony that allow the wife to weaponize the government's coercive power to extract resources from the husband without mutual consent. The state acts as the ultimate lawyer, mediating and extracting value from the domestic dispute.
By removing the state entirely, and by locking property rights into immutable smart contracts that cannot be altered by a family court judge, you force the family unit into a state of absolute mutual dependence.
Exactly. The man controls the external resource acquisition. The woman controls the internal lineage and competence development. Neither party has the ability to leverage a third-party government entity to coerce, threaten, or extract from the other.
The structural incentives for domestic betrayal or parasitic extraction are mathematically eliminated.
The authors don't just propose this philosophically, by the way. They actually attempted to prove it mathematically. They ran a complex Python simulation to model the thermodynamics of this exact societal structure.
Oh, wow.
They engineered an agent-based simulation. The parameters modeled 50 independent family units interacting over a span of 20 generations in a defined grid environment with localized resource regeneration rates.
What were they tracking?
They tracked a multitude of variables: total resource accumulation, the probabilistic inheritance of management competence, and the frequency of interfamily conflicts, essentially, instances where families attempted to extract resources from one another by force.
Let's break down the data. What happened when they ran the baseline scenario, modeling a society without automated property management, relying purely on human inheritance, and the traditional lord-lawyer dynamic?
The baseline simulation resulted in a total, unrecoverable thermodynamic collapse. The mathematical reality of incompetence creep dominated the system.
As competent wealth creators died and passed resources to probabilistically less competent heirs, the overall efficiency of resource management plummeted.
Resentment spiked. The data showed that massive systemic conflicts, wars over dwindling resources, broke out in 14 out of the 20 generations.
The wealth was constantly being destroyed by the friction of fighting over it.
By the end of the 20th generation, the total resources available to the 50 families crashed to an asymptotic near zero. The specific metric output was 4e minus 144.
Wait, we need to pause on that number, because 4e minus 144 isn't just a severe economic recession. In mathematical terms, 10 to the negative 144th power is effectively absolute zero.
It implies a literal civilizational heat death. It means not a single agent in the simulation had enough caloric or material resources to execute a single action. Extinction.
Complete systemic failure.
But then they altered the parameters. They flipped the switch, engaging the automated property management algorithms to instantly reallocate resources based on systemic efficiency rather than human hoarding.
And simultaneously, they enforced the highly specific, gendered familial roles for resource acquisition and internal progeny management.
Right.
And what were the outputs of the automated simulation?
The system stabilized entirely. The automated management algorithms perfectly compensated for the biological decay of human competence, ensuring that resources were always optimally deployed.
Because resource disparities were kept mathematically tight and justified by active acquisition rather than stagnant hoarding, the envy and resentment that trigger class warfare simply vanished.
The conflict matrix dropped to absolute zero over the entire 20-generation run.
Zero conflicts. A perfectly peaceful, mathematically balanced society. Now, I have to step in and aggressively challenge this logic.
Sure.
A spreadsheet showing zero conflicts is pristine, but we are dealing with the messy, unpredictable reality of human biology. What about the outliers? What if a specific woman possesses a brilliant, aggressive intellect, perfectly suited for coding smart contracts or acquiring land, but possesses zero maternal instinct?
That's a very fair point.
What if a specific man is highly empathetic, risk-averse, and perfectly suited to manage the internal education of the progeny? If this society enforces such a rigid binary architecture, doesn't it fundamentally stifle individual human talent and generate a massive subterranean layer of psychological misery?
The expert analysis within the sources actually concedes this exact vulnerability. They openly acknowledge that this is a politically incorrect edge of their model, and that enforcing rigid gender roles assumes a baseline of heteronormativity while ignoring the statistical reality of diverse orientations, neurodivergence, or exceptional individual talents.
They admit that locking outliers into roles they are biologically or psychologically unfit for would breed immense resentment, potentially triggering mini revolts within the family units themselves.
They do. They note that in a practical, real-world application, such a system would require a degree of localized flexibility to accommodate outliers and prevent domestic structural failure over the long term.
But they still stick to their main point.
Yes. They steadfastly maintain their core thesis at a macro-statistical level when designing an architecture for thousands of family units over centuries, aligning the baseline societal structures with broad evolutionary biological averages, yields the highest probability of stable, long-term thermodynamic equilibrium.
It is a profound, incredibly tense debate between the requirement for aggregate systemic stability and the fundamental human desire for individual freedom and self-actualization. But it leaves me with a massive practical logistical question.
Well, there's that.
If these family units are totally sovereign, essentially acting as isolated, self-contained microstates, how do they interact with the broader world? How does a family buy groceries or acquire concrete or trade solar panels with another family without slowly reinventing the exact same physical markets, trade guilds, and state bureaucracies they just destroyed?
The solution to that logistical hurdle lies in a shadowy, highly encrypted, purely digital marketplace that the sources call the Molt Book.
Here's where the architecture gets genuinely mind-bending. We are moving into the realm of anonymous AI agents in cryptographic environments. This sounds like something pulled directly from a cyberpunk novel, but the text treats it as an imminent engineering reality. What exactly is a Molt Book?
The Moltbook is conceptualized as a vast, decentralized, hyper-encrypted ledger environment. The critical defining feature of the Moltbook is that human beings never directly interact with it. It is an environment where artificial intelligence agents interact solely with other artificial intelligence agents.
So, my family possesses an AI agent. It acts as our interface with the global economy. It's essentially a hyper-competent, mathematically infallible digital butler whose only directive is to ensure our family's survival and prosperity.
Precisely. Let's run a hypothetical scenario. Your family unit requires a specific resource, say 1,000 square meters of arable land for agricultural production, or high-efficiency solar panels to repair your energy grid.
Right.
You don't drive to a physical market, you don't negotiate with a human vendor, and you certainly don't petition a government zoning board. Your family's AI agent simply broadcasts an anonymous, encrypted demand directly into the Moltbook network.
It effectively signals, I represent an anonymous, verified entity that requires X amount of land.
Yes.
But wait, if the system is entirely anonymous and there is no state police force to audit anyone, what prevents me from simply programming my AI to lie? What stops me from acting exactly like a greedy pre-automation lord, hoarding millions of acres of land by submitting fake anonymous demands? How does the system verify anything without revealing who I am?
This is where we have to dive into one of the most critical, complex cryptographic technologies underpinning this entire vision, zero-knowledge proofs, or ZKPs. Specifically, advanced protocols known as ZK-SNARKs and ZK-STARKs.
I know these terms are heavily discussed in advanced cryptocurrency circles, but we need to break down exactly how a ZK snark functions in this specific context without relying on overly simplistic analogies. We're talking about cryptographic proving circuits.
A zero-knowledge, succinct, non-interactive argument of knowledge, a ZK-SNARK, is a cryptographic mechanism that allows one party, the prover, to mathematically prove to another party, the verifier, that a highly specific computational statement is undeniably true without revealing any of the underlying data that makes it true.
Explain the actual mechanics of how my AI uses a proving circuit to acquire that land.
When your AI broadcasts the demand for land, it doesn't just ask. It processes your family's internal data, your caloric needs, your historical production output, your current localized digital assets through a complex mathematical algorithm known as a proving circuit.
And this circuit generates a hash.
Yes. This circuit generates a unique cryptographic hash. This hash acts as an absolute mathematical guarantee. Your AI submits this hash to the Moltbook.
And the other AI agents on the network can look at that hash, run a verification algorithm against it, and mathematically confirm that my family possesses a legitimate systemic need for the land, and that we possess the verified digital assets to execute the trade.
Exactly. The network verifies the integrity of the hash without ever having access to the underlying inputs. The transaction is validated, the smart contract executes, and the land is transferred.
And at no point did your AI reveal your geographic location, your identity, or the total aggregate wealth your family possesses.
It is an entirely trustless system. I don't need to trust the physical human on the other side of the transaction, and I don't need a state regulator to oversee it because the cryptography itself mathematically proves that the transaction is valid and systemically balanced.
Because no human data is ever exposed to the network, there is zero surface area for human bias. A smart contract cannot discriminate based on race or gender because it literally cannot see those variables.
There is no room for political favors. And crucially, there is absolutely no way for a centralized government to track, aggregate, or tax your wealth.
Which exposes a massive gaping hole in the societal fabric. If there are no national taxes, if the state cannot extract a percentage of my income or property, how does anything resembling public infrastructure get funded? More importantly, how does this society replace the welfare system? If a family suffers a catastrophic failure, how do they survive without a state safety net?
The sources propose replacing the entire apparatus of national taxation and centralized welfare with a highly localized algorithmic system called Dynamic Smart Credit, or DSC.
How does DSC function on a daily basis?
In the Moltbook environment, the concept of utilizing currency at the point of physical sale is largely eliminated. You don't swipe a credit card or hand over physical cash to buy a loaf of bread or consume electricity.
So what happens?
Instead, every single act of physical or digital consumption is tracked internally by your family's AI agent. This consumption dynamically generates a localized societal debt on your private, encrypted ledger.
I need to push back hard on this. If my AI tracks every watt of power I use and every calorie I consume and assigns me a debt score, That sounds dangerously close to the ultimate authoritarian social credit score. It sounds like a dystopian nightmare where my every move is quantified.
It is very easy to interpret it that way, but the text draws a massive fundamental distinction between a central state social credit score and this decentralized system.
What's the difference?
A state social credit score is punitive, centralized, and designed to enforce political compliance. The state sees your data and punishes you for dissent. The dynamic smart credit system is entirely localized and mathematically objective. It is a thermodynamic ledger, not a political one. The broader network does not see your score, only your isolated AI sees it.
So how do I clear the ledger? If I consume 10,000 kilowatt hours of energy to run my family's agricultural equipment, how do I pay that back without a central currency?
To reconcile your localized debt, your AI interfaces with the Moltbook and dynamically generates personalized, gamified gigs or microtasks that are perfectly tailored to your family's specific verified competencies.
So it finds work for me.
The system identifies a systemic need nearby. Your AI might prompt you to balance your ledger for this month's energy consumption. You must spend 4 hours auditing the code for the localized solar grid. Or you must perform physical maintenance on the communal water filtration system for 2 days.
It functions as an invisible, hyper-efficient, autonomous immune system for the macroeconomy. It constantly dynamically balances physical resources and human labor.
And because the transactions are direct and algorithmic, no human, politician, union boss, or bureaucrat ever gets the chance to insert themselves as a middleman.
No one can skim off the top, play favorites, or build a political advocacy empire out of the welfare system. If you consume resources from the network, you owe the network a proportionate, mathematically precise amount of value, and your AI finds the most efficient, friction-free way for you to provide that value.
Precisely. And it mathematically prevents the idiocracy syndrome we discussed earlier. You cannot have an unemployable mass simply existing on UBI in a toy economy, because in the Moltbook system, consumption absolutely requires a reciprocal, productive contribution to the tool economy. It forces competence.
This all sounds like a brilliant, pristine software solution. It is elegant, mathematically sound code, but we still live in a physical universe. I cannot sleep inside a smart contract.
Very true.
I cannot eat a zero-knowledge proof. A digital token representing land doesn't stop the rain. How does this entirely automated, anonymous, state-free system actually manipulate physical matter? How does it build the future?
This leads to the final and perhaps most logistically complex phase of the blueprint, the physical realization of the code. We are looking at the deployment of autonomous robot construction networks and a development strategy the sources term "damn the torpedoes."
The text outlines a vision of physical automation that borders on hardcore science fiction, but they anchor it aggressively in emerging technologies from the mid-2020s. We are talking about decentralized physical infrastructure networks, or DEPEN, utilizing autonomous robot swarms.
Yes, the concepts trace back to theoretical physics like Eric Drexler's molecular assemblers and modern advancements in DNA-based nanobots. But on a macro civilizational scale, they're looking at massive decentralized networks of physical machinery operating entirely on blockchain logic.
Walk me through the actual physical mechanics of this. How does an anonymous smart contract build a house?
We can look at the specific examples highlighted in the text, such as the conceptual frameworks of the 3DS network or advanced iterations of libwork. Imagine a fleet of autonomous, mobile, industrial 3D printing robots. They are essentially mobile gantries.
Okay, so a giant 3D printer on wheels.
An AI agent on the Moltbook identifies an empty, tokenized parcel of land that requires development. The smart contract funds the operation using decentralized capital pools. The robot swarm physically mobilizes, navigates to the GPS coordinates of the parcel, and over the course of 24 to 72 hours, autonomously extrudes a modular concrete composite structure layer by layer.
Wait, you can tokenize a smart contract all you want, but if an anonymous robot builds a house on a plot of land, who owned the dirt? If there is no state to enforce a property line, how does the robot know it has the right to build there? How do they acquire the physical concrete?
The sourcing of physical materials in a DEPEN network is handled via automated supply chain contracts. The robots pull from localized, automated materials silos, funded by the same decentralized capital.
And the land ownership.
As for the ownership of the dirt, the sources propose that physical enforcement relies on localized robotic defense protocols and severe economic ostracization via the Moltbook. If a neighbor physically encroaches on the land, the system instantly severs their dynamic smart credit, isolating them from the economy entirely. The network defends the property economically.
Assuming they secure the dirt and build the structure, How is it transferred to a human without a real estate agent?
Once the physical structure is complete, the robot swarm installs specialized Internet of Things (IoT) smart locks. The house is entirely sealed. It remains cryptographically locked and uninhabitable.
So no one can get in.
The smart contract broadcasts a dynamically generated typo-tolerant Bitcoin address to the network. The house sits empty until a buyer's AI agent confirms the transaction and sends the required Bitcoin payment to that specific address.
And then it just opens.
The exact millisecond that transaction achieves sufficient confirmations on the blockchain, the smart contract triggers the IoT lock, instantly releasing the physical digital key to the new owner's wallet.
The robots build it, seal it, and drive away. The first entity to satisfy the mathematical condition of the smart contract gets to physically walk inside. It is wild. But we have to inject some brutal realism here.
Absolutely.
How on earth do you execute this in a modern city? What local zoning board, what permit office, what city council is going to approve a swarm of anonymous robots building concrete structures overnight without environmental reviews, safety inspections, or tax assessments?
They absolutely will not approve it. And that is the core tactical reality of the source's proposal. They do not advocate for asking permission. They suggest an incredibly aggressive, asymmetrical deployment strategy, the torpedoes approach.
This is essentially the Uber strategy, but applied to physical architecture.
Precisely. Consider how Uber disrupted the transportation industry. They didn't spend years lobbying local taxi commissions for legal permission to operate. They simply flooded the streets of major cities with thousands of drivers simultaneously.
They openly ignored local regulations.
They paid the inevitable fines out of massive venture capital war chests and built such a massive reliant user base so quickly that the regulators were politically forced to capitulate and rewrite the laws to accommodate them. The disruption outpaced the bureaucracy.
But Uber had a massive corporate headquarters in San Francisco. They had a CEO you could subpoena. They had a centralized bank account you could freeze.
And that is where this strategy escalates to the ultimate level. The sources propose deploying these robotic construction swarms completely anonymously. The capital funding the swarms originates from decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, with treasuries spread across thousands of anonymous crypto wallets globally.
Wow, so they just deploy them.
The swarms are programmed to build with such fury, speed, and geographic dispersion that local regulators, zoning boards, and permit enforcement officers simply cannot physically respond fast enough.
And because the entire command and control structure is decentralized and encrypted on a blockchain, the state has no target. There is no CEO to arrest. There is no corporate headquarters to raid. There is no single bank account to freeze. It is an unstoppable, self-funding, anonymous housing printer operating outside the bounds of human law.
Yes.
But building a two-story concrete structure is fundamentally different than hailing a ride in a sedan. The expert analysis in the text itself has to recognize the physical limitations of this.
It does, and the text heavily tempers the utopian vision with cold realism. While the physical robotics are advancing rapidly, we are seeing massive mobile gantries like Icon's Vulcan printers actively building housing developments today. Pure physical anonymity in the real world is incredibly fragile.
Right. A city government does not need to decrypt a zero-knowledge proof or arrest a CEO to stop a house from being built. They possess the ultimate physical override. They own bulldozers.
You can't code away a crowbar, and you can't encrypt a bulldozer. If a city decides a structure is unpermitted and dangerous, they can just physically destroy it.
And the sources acknowledge massive liability and safety vulnerabilities.
They discuss extreme, almost science fiction scenarios where the robots might theoretically build their own defensive nanobots, self-destruct upon completion to eliminate forensic evidence, and rely on incomprehensible, air-gapped blockchain forks to manage the network invisibly.
Which introduces an entirely new tier of risk. If a house is built by an anonymous robot swarm in 24 hours, completely bypassing structural engineering reviews, electrical safety inspections, and foundational testing, what happens if it collapses and crushes a family?
That's the ultimate question.
Who is responsible?
Yeah.
You cannot sue a robot that is self-destructed. You cannot serve a subpoena to a cryptographic hash.
It highlights the absolute unresolvable tension at the very core of this entire blueprint. It is the eternal battle between ultimate, frictionless freedom and necessary systemic safety. It is the ultimate libertarian stress test applied to physical reality.
It forces a terrifying question. I have to ask you, the listener, directly. Would you genuinely feel safe putting your children to sleep in a house that was built in the dead of night, in 24 hours by an anonymous, untraceable swarm of robots that explicitly bypassed every single safety regulation in existence, simply because the structure was cheap and you could unlock the front door with Bitcoin. Are you willing to trade the safety net of the state for the absolute freedom of the code?
That is the threshold question of the entire paradigm.
Okay, we have covered an immense, exhausting amount of conceptual ground today. Let's pull back and summarize the architecture we've explored. We have mapped out a truly radical, comprehensive blueprint for a post-state civilization, a reality where the endless historical thermodynamic cycle of class warfare, the lords hoarding resources and the lawyers manipulating the masses to extract them, is permanently broken by the implementation of cold, impartial, smart contracts.
We have examined the mechanics of how anonymous artificial intelligence agents operating within the encrypted Moltbook environment could dynamically manage our macroeconomic needs.
Utilizing zero-knowledge proofs and localized dynamic smart credit to reconcile our societal debts without relying on traditional fiat currency, central banks, or national taxation.
And we've explored the profound societal shift that occurs in the absence of a state bureaucracy, how sovereign biological families might reclaim their position as the absolute, decentralized core unit of human governance, occupying physical structures built furiously and anonymously by autonomous robotic networks.
Whether you evaluate this vision as a beautiful, mathematically pure utopia of efficiency, or a rigid, terrifying dystopia devoid of human warmth, it serves an incredibly profound diagnostic purpose.
It forces us to rigorously, objectively question the actual value and stability of our current political and economic systems. Are we currently trapped in an endless, degrading cycle of grievance and incompetence creep?
Is the technology we're developing today building a robust tool economy that fosters genuine competence, or are we accelerating toward a terminal toy economy of endless, pacifying digital distraction?
It fundamentally alters the lens through which you view the infrastructure around you.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as we close. It is a concept we didn't explicitly debate today, but it lingers like a shadow just beneath the surface of all these advanced technical sources.
Okay, what is it?
If we actually succeed, if we engineer an incorruptible, perfectly cold, mathematically infallible automated system to manage all of our property, execute all of our logistics, build our physical houses, and perfectly balance our resources without a single drop of human friction, what happens to human purpose?
That is profound.
If all the mountains are finally moved by the machines, do we truly become free, self-actualized creators?
Yep.
Or, trapped safely inside the pristine architecture of our own perfect, unbreakable code, do we simply become obsolete biological pets to our own algorithms? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking at the underlying mechanics, and we'll see you next time.